of what we were thinking and how we wanted to put this session together. So as you all know, President-elect Biden, he's called on a deeply divided nation to come together, to unite, and to heal. But to do that, we can't just have dialogue. We can't just talk our way out of this. We're going to have to address the grievances and build resiliency in the United States. If we have to address the structural problems that got us to where we are today. Again, dialogue is just not going to get us out of it. Being more civil is not going to get us out of it. So this panel, this session today, have, I think, some really incredible people that have been doing a lot of work on this subject. First, I'm going to start off, and you'll be introduced to Rudabeh Kishti. She's the Director of Research and Innovation for the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLA. And why is this so important? ACLA wasn't working in the US up until about, and Rudabeh can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about 6 months ago, a year ago. It's only been within this year that ACLA has really started looking at the data of violence and conflict in the United States. And why is that so critical? Because data equals policy. Without it, people don't know how bad something is happening or where it's not happening. And so she's going to talk to us a little bit about their project and what they're seeing. The second speaker is Shelley Mark. And I hope you all saw her and Joe Bubman, who is the next speaker. They were the Melanie Greenberg Award winners for the U.S. Peacebuilding and Excellence. And Shelley most recently was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And she worked with her very closely on the legislation that has been introduced on reparations and looking at what you can do in terms of reparations for the Black community and to address some of the systemic racism issues that we've had since the beginning of our nation. Right now, she is the let me make sure I get this right. She is she's working with Instagram, and she's the Civic Engagement and Racial Justice Public Policy Manager at Instagram. So we are just so thrilled to have her. Next is Joe Bubman. He is the founder and the executive director of Urban Rural Action. And what makes Joe so interesting, I think, is that he recognizes that we have to look at what is happening in other parts of our country. And again, it's not just about dialogue, it's about addressing some of those structural problems that are very polarizing. Joe also came from Mercy Corps. He has a significant background working overseas with Mercy Corps in other countries and fragile and conflict-affected countries. And he felt so strongly that things were not going well in the United States that he stopped working internationally and started working on these issues in our own backyard in the United States. Our last presenter is Julia Roy, and she is the CEO and president of Partners Global, which works internationally. They have programs and partners all over the world, but she is really focusing on narratives and how do we change the narrative? How do we understand what we're talking about? And how do we talk to each other in a way that we're not causing harm? And at the same time, being able to understand what's happening. And again, how do we do it? How do we do it better? How do we change that narrative? So she's going to talk a lot about that project and the research. And that's, I think, the really key piece is it's really focused on research. So it's not just what we think, it's what we know and have applied to other other sectors. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rutabe and let her talk to us about ACLED and the data. So Rutabe, let me find you. There you go.
Here I am. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Liz, and for putting together this really interesting panel. As you mentioned, I mean, for those who aren't interested or not familiar with us, so ACLED, we are an NGO. We're a team of researchers who systematically track political violence and demonstrations around the world, and we make real-time data available for public use. And so we began coverage of the U.S. in really the same way earlier this year, as Liz mentioned. Initially, as part of a special project, the U.S. Crisis Monitor, the plan is to continue regular coverage on all the other parts of the globe that we cover. The U.S. Crisis Monitor project supports data-driven initiatives to build community resilience and facilitate efforts to track, prevent, and mitigate political violence in the U.S. So the special project has been a joint project with the Bridging Divides initiative at Princeton. And the aim of it is really to provide the public with real-time data and analysis. And I think Liz put it in a really good way around, not just what we think, but like what we know to be the case, with like numbers and the receipts to back it up, so to speak. And the real-time data analysis on political violence and demonstrations can then help to establish an evidence base around which to identify risks, hotspots, and to know where available resources could be targeted to empower local communities, for example, in times of crisis, like the election period, for example. And having access to real-time data and robust data really is really crucial if we want to break through, I think, these chains of anecdotes alone. So moving beyond simply one-off examples to more robust analysis that can really challenge like deeply entrenched ideas about what's happening, where, why. I think a good example of that kind of elsewhere is data on gun violence, for example. The stats and figures that those initiatives have helped to collate have been really crucial in communicating to and helping policymakers to understand how owning a gun makes you, exponentially more at risk of gun violence or death or injury. And in this way, the stats and figures have really helped to challenge anecdotes, especially around inaccurate narratives. And that's what we were able to do, for example, earlier this summer. We released a report building off of the data we've collected, noting how over 93% of protests associated with the Black Lives Matter movement have been peaceful, where demonstrators haven't engaged in violence or destructive behavior. And that stat, I think, has really helped advocates and peace builders to really challenge stubborn narratives around who's doing what, where the risk is, and what forms it might manifest, especially as it really countered the prevalent narrative that was and really continues to be touted by the media and by the right, that BLM protests have been violent or that they've been rife with destructive behavior like looting or vandalism or violence. Since the release of that report, a lot of policymakers, including governors, congressmen, state senators, representatives, have all used ACLED data to ground the broader debate over racial justice demonstrations and the threat of political violence around the election. So the data have been cited in House Homeland Security Committee hearings on national security threats, the FBI, during the counterpart hearing held by the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and most recently by former First Lady Michelle Obama during her final closing argument speech ahead of the general election. Since the summer before the election, we put out another report which looked at the threat and the risks posed by right-wing militias specifically during the election period. By building on the data that we've collected, especially through partnerships with other organizations that can help us to supplement our information and data, like Militia Watch, for example, who tracks militia activities in the US online. And we put out analysis that could be used as early warning by peace builders, by local law enforcement, for really practical preparation for the election. And the report used data to identify what are drivers of militia activity in order to identify where the risk of militia activity is highest in the lead up to, during, and now in the aftermath of the election, in places like Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Wisconsin. And in response to the report, we saw local media outlets, for example, picking up the findings and presenting the assessments to local government officials and law enforcement to really question them about their efforts to secure the election. We spoke with election observers that, especially in states that are at high risk of militia activity, use the findings to train their teams on what to beware of, for example. And the overall outcome was a positive one, which was an election day with really limited interference. Now, tomorrow, we will be publishing a new report, for those of you interested, where we are focusing on tracking the key shifts in unrest from the start of the summer to the election and its aftermath. And I can quickly share some of those trends with you now, if I figure out how to use. Can you all see this, hopefully? So this, for example, is a graph where you can see how demonstrations associated with the BLM movement, which is the line in navy, has significantly declined since the height in the aftermath, or the immediate aftermath of Floyd's killing. And this has really been impacted by disproportionate engagement and use of force by law enforcement against these protesters. Reports of those arrested being met with really excessive charges, threatening long prison terms as a suppression tactic, really to dissuade their engagement in demonstrations. And of course, through intimidation by armed illegal militias present at these protests. Right-wing demonstrations, which is the red line, however, have stayed really constant since they haven't been met with these obstacles, and so their activity hasn't changed and in fact has been trending upwards. Here you can see that in fact we find that right-wing demonstrations have been met with intervention by law enforcement less than 4% of the time, which is far less frequently relative to BLM protests, which are being met with intervention nearly 10% of the time. And when authorities have engaged in demonstrations, they've used force against BLM demonstrators over half the time, which is the bar on the left, while only 1/3 of the time in response to right-wing protests, which is the bar on the right. And this trend holds even if we were to look only at cases where demonstrators didn't engage in any violence or destructive behavior, suggesting that government intervention and use of force are not merely set responses to demonstrator behavior. They're rather part of this broader attitude, policy, or a really strategic approach to different types of mobilization in different contexts. We also look at Stop the Steal demonstrations since the election, which have been taking place, as you can see, around the country. And they very often have militias involved in them. These are all the teal circles. And here you can see how the rate of involvement of militias in these demonstrations has risen really dramatically since the election. And that's that period in gray at the end of the graph. In fact, you can see here how Stop the Steal demonstrations, there have been really disproportionate engagement by militia groups in them relative to other protests. So militia groups have participated in 18% of all Stop the Steal demonstrations, which is the bar on the right, but they've engaged in less than 1% of demonstrations, all other demonstrations, which is the bar on the left. And what we found is that when militias engage in right-wing demonstrations, the demonstrations tend to turn violent or destructive more frequently. So 12% of the time, which is the bar on the left. And that's relative to other right-wing demonstrations that don't have militias directly involved, which see less than 3% of the time that happening. And so in this sense, the presence of a militia at a demonstration increases the risk of violent or destructive activity even before the event begins. These are just some of the trends that are featured in the report, but I think they're important because they're trends that we're able to see or even really notice beyond just anecdotally, only through careful tracking and then analysis of data. Pro-Trump and right-wing organizing has really changed significantly since the election, and it's really likely to continue to evolve into next week's confirmations, into next month's inauguration, and beyond, into the initial stages of the Biden administration. Demonstrations are really increasingly in groups, like I mentioned, but they also include armed, decentralized, and potentially violent individuals, especially those responding to calls to action. They involve unarmed but mass mobilization. And they also involve sporadic attacks by sole perpetrators. And importantly, I think, is that networking and recruitment across these right-wing group identities at these demonstrations has the potential for further ideological escalation into the future. And given the really local nature of these protests, local politics are also impacting the political inclinations of demonstrators, and in turn are creating spaces for coalition building, for cross-pollination amongst these participating movements. So looking forward, many of the same political strains that have been impacting social movements, mobilization, even violence over the summer have really persisted through the election and are going to continue in the near future. This includes the coronavirus crisis, which has really only just worsened recently, and increased government restrictions, especially those that Biden has already been hinting to, taking into account in his first days in office, are really likely to elicit an armed right-wing response, as they've been doing throughout the pandemic already at a more local level. In addition, I think that right-wing worries around gun regulation could foster mobilization, as can left-wing organizing, which tends to elicit a reactive response from the right. And so monitoring these types of risk factors will be really critical for efforts to prevent peaceful mobilization from devolving into political violence and mitigating the threat of violent instability through inauguration and beyond inauguration, which will be really important, not only I think for peace builders, but also for eliciting policy solutions. I had hoped to share with you all the US Crisis Monitor dashboard, which hopefully I can soon figure out how to drop a link to in the chats or something for you all, where you can interact with the data. You can not only download the data, as I mentioned, it's publicly accessible, but for those of you who are not spreadsheet forward, there's an interactive dashboard that allows you to kind of play with the data to understand trends, understand where Black Lives Matter protests are happening, where specific trends like car rammings or targeting of journalists, things like that may be happening, different militia groups. So all of that is available for public use. Maybe I'll stop there, but I look forward to Q&A after all the presentations.
Okay, well, Rutabaga, as you were talking, questions were coming in fast and furious. So, some of the thoughts of, this is super depressing. I just want to ask you a couple clarifying points really quickly. Sure. Did you get any pushback on this data from anyone saying this isn't true? And also, too, somebody commented about some of the echoing. I think it's coming from Rutabaga. So when she's not talking, don't worry about it. It's okay. Someone just asked about the echoing. I think it's coming from Rutabaga. So when she's not talking, she'll mute herself and it'll be okay. But don't worry. It's not bad. So did you get any pushback from anybody saying this isn't true? And also somebody asked really quickly, how did you decide to use the term militia? I know this has been a big issue in the Trust network. What do you call people instead? Is it militias, unarmed militia, or domestic terrorists?
Sure. So I can feel both of those. So firstly, yes, we have pushback. I mean, I think anyone who frankly doesn't like what the numbers are showing, the easiest kind of attack is that the numbers must be wrong. To kind of counter that, we try to be as transparent as possible. There are more methodology documents than probably any of you would like to suffer through, but are available to you on the website that explain exactly all of the different coding kind of decisions that we've weighed and how we have, come to decisions around them. And especially so that if you don't agree with that decision, you can account for that in the data. If you don't think we should have categorized such and such group as a militia, categorize them differently in your work if you want. But we've explained to you why we categorize each one in the way that we do. And I think beyond kind of those initial steps that we can take, you will always, I think, have pushback. I mean, we see that in all spaces, whether it's, gun violence regulation, whether it's coronavirus numbers of cases, whatever it might be, there's always going to be those that kind of counter that. For the word militia, I'll just start by saying that ACLED, as you started by introducing Liz, we are a global organization, which means that one of the things that I think make ACLED data useful is the fact that we apply a systematic, standardized methodology across all of our regions. So this way you can compare what the US looks like to what any other country around the world looks like to understand trends, and that you're not comparing apples to oranges. this is one of the primary issues, I think, and where I think some of our value add is that there were a lot of great data collection initiatives happening in the U.S. that would track, whether it's just protest, whether it's police violence, whether it's gun violence. It's different subsets of what we track, but then they also only track this in the U.S., which makes it difficult to compare if you don't have a systematic methodology against another country. And so in that vein is why we use the word militia, because we use the word militia everywhere. We understand militias to be operating outside of the law. If they are officially part of the state or have direct links to the state apparatus, then we would code them as the state. And that's kind of why we have been using that word, and we strive to use the same word in the US to not underline some kind of American exceptionalism where what looks in the US looks different than elsewhere. Because yes, parts of it are unique to the US, but in a lot of ways, what we see in the US looks a lot like what we see around elections in other states. I'll also say that we avoid the use of the word terrorist because terror tactics are a tactic that frankly anyone can use. Arguably, a lot of government, like armies, militaries around the world, use terror tactics in what they're doing. Defining a group as specifically the type of tactic they use suggests that other groups do not use that same tactic, which is why we don't use the word terrorist. That doesn't imply validation of these groups. It doesn't imply that they don't use terror tactics. They do. A lot of what they do is intimidation that comes out of invoking terror. So it's not meant to suggest that they are not using these types of tactics, but that's why we are really sensitive and specific about the words we use, especially to ensure that we are using the same words to talk about the same things across different spaces.
Yeah, and just to note, is it someone hearing that echo? Yeah. Let me just see if I can, I'll close some things and see if that helps. Is that helping? Yeah. We do the same thing at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. We don't use terrorism. We say violent extremists, for example. Okay, so one other really quick thing. Everybody wants to know, where's this report that you had up there? Is that public?
It will be published tomorrow. I'm giving
Yay! Okay, so that's, I can't tell you how many people are like, where's that report? Okay, so again, this ACLID and what they're doing in the US is so critical. I know other organizations are, saying hate crimes went up and this, but this data is really critical. Okay, so moving on to Shelley. And Shelley, why I'm so glad you're here is, we have been starting to work more closely with civil rights organizations and human rights organizations, and what we can learn from you and what you can learn from our community, and how do we work really closely together. So we've started working together in a coalition recently, but anyway, so I'm thrilled Shelley's here and now she's part of our community. So Shelley, talk to us about what you think are some of the issues and how we can practically deal with them.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I am so happy to be here and to join this great conversation that we're having today. So for me, as you mentioned, I worked on the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Resolution when I was with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and still working on pushing that resolution in the House, Senate, and also hopefully via executive order. And basically the issue that we're having, and we see it in our nation, is we are deeply divided racially and culturally. And it's based off of this misguided premise of a human hierarchy that has been with us since American slavery and is just deeply rooted within our systems. And it was established, frankly, from our government itself. So we really need to look at tackling these issues. And I feel like a first step in that direction is looking at passing Congresswoman Barbara Lee's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Resolution, which works hand in hand with HR 40. We must establish the truth of what has happened. We must create archives and libraries across the country and work with the coalitions partnerships that are taking place at different universities and within different communities. We've seen a lot of truth work happen across the world. And I think it's just a matter of time before we're finally in this opening. Currently, we see racial equity issues have been a huge problem from back when Trayvon Martin passed away to now, as recently as George Floyd. And we see the divide that's happening here. And today it's coronavirus. A few years ago, it was the crash that happened, the housing crash during 9/11. And every other time, we're going to know that there's a reason why these issues continue to disproportionately impact communities of color. So just really looking at how we can go about forming this commission and working closely with our members of Congress and also the Biden-Harris administration, as they have said that they're committed to establishing a racial equity plan and having those much needed conversations to break down this division and start healing our country.
So Shelley, and we know Senator Booker just introduced a companion piece in the Senate. So how do you think, this is a commission, right? So, if you could tell us a little bit, and we're like, commissions, it'll take a while, it's meant to be, or it is meant to be bipartisan. Is that correct as well?
Yes, okay. Of course, with any bill, I think it's important to have bipartisan support. Currently, we are still working on that. I do feel like there might be some movement in this space, maybe on the Senate side. But yes, this is a nonpartisan issue. So right. We would love folks to come on both sides of the aisle for sure.
Okay. So in terms of, you don't want to pre-cook something, right? Because you're looking at a commission. But what are some of the key issues, that can be, you think that will be, and I don't want to say this in terms of, because, there's so many issues and it's such a complex set of issues. What are some of the key things that are the most critical, kind of in an early and then, down the road? And what are the easiest things to bring to scale? Because I think that's what, people get really, into something, even when we're working overseas. We have an incredible project that's working, in a community, but, how do we bring this to scale? So what are some of those, if you can just kind of point out some of those key pieces that you think will have the biggest impact?
Right. We just had a whole conversation and presentation. Data is extremely important. We need qualitative and quantitative data in one space. We need to show and prove, especially if we're trying to get those individuals on both sides of the aisle, that this actually happened. I think something that we see often in our individuals trying to not validate the fact that this is true, that we actually do have systemic racism in our country, redlining, and, there are so much facts that show it. This is not just, my feelings and a story time. So that's a huge piece of it, which, as I mentioned, those libraries that we need to start that, the archives, to tell that racial history, that's a huge piece. And I think that is a very tangible piece, especially if we figure out where we can fund this, maybe through the appropriations process. Maybe individuals are not ready, with commissions to talk about, reparations right now. But even for reparations, you need to come to a point where you're showing why we deserve this, why this needs to happen. And I think that data piece is a huge part of that.
Okay, so I couldn't agree with you more. And on that note, we did have a panel on it. The Alliance for Peacebuilding is working with New Gen Peace Builders, Rotary, the Institute for Economics for Peace, on taking some pilot curriculum in Mobile, Alabama, and in Vermont, the state of Vermont, with looking at history curriculum. And how do you take a peace building lens and a civil rights lens? We go from war to war to war. We run out of time, and about Vietnam, but every American in high school has to take a US history class, right? So that's one start. So that's an example of, that work happening. Okay, so, and this is really, I think, the hard part of it. Can you also comment one more thing I would like you to talk about? I was really struck, and I live in a very liberal town in Northern Virginia, and extremely liberal. And we vote at high rates, 87% turnout. We are really struggling with the systemic racism and understanding how good white liberals have perpetuated this. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then we'll move into Joe's presentation as well.
Right. I think that there is a lot of conversations about white guilt or individuals feeling not completely understanding, and a lot of it has to do with what you mentioned, it not being a part of our history. Like, yes, we have American history, but there was a great tweet that I saw, which was like, Black history is a part of American history. And of course, within the truth racial healing process, it's not just about the Black and Brown community, but a lot of other communities that are impacted by the systems that we have in this country, and just that natural idea of the hierarchy of human life, really. And a lot of people are just not aware of it. It's an awareness piece. And then once they're hit with it, it's really hard to grasp it, because you're like, I'm a good person. I would never do these things or feel that way. So, I mean, it's a knowledge piece. It's also understanding that me as a Black or brown woman, it is not my job to teach you about what is going on, but being intentional in that process. And it's not that I'm looking for an apology, but that, understanding why and understanding the systems and the solutions that we need to get to. So I totally can see that, especially working on Capitol Hill and for a progressive member. But sometimes people who have really good intentions don't realize that when they're saying no or not right now for some bills, such as HCON Res 100 or HR 40, who they've been pushing that bill for 30 years, it can be very difficult to separate that from, like, why are you just in a way underlying supportive of that systemic racism and don't even know it, even though you identify as very liberal or progressive. So, these are those difficult conversations that we have to continue to have, that we need to start having more and more. And I'm just excited about this year and how it has come from more of, like, the professionals and the individuals who are studying this, to now the whole world is really having these conversations. And it's a very healthy thing. And I'm excited that it's happening now.
So I want you to say, in this whole conference, I think you're the first person to say, I'm excited about 2020. So I think that this is a really important point, though, because, and Julia's going to talk about it later, but it's this us versus them, blue versus red. There's a lot more blue that is perpetuating this and part of the problem as well. So I think this is going to be a really important point, and Julia's going to get to that. And on that note, let's turn to Joe, because he's also working with people in the heartland or the rural areas. And I actually sent you a screenshot today of something out of the Washington Post, Joe. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. But
yeah, thanks, Liz, and great to be on this panel. I think what you're referring to, Liz, was the use of the word suckers to describe people who supported President Trump. And I think that is just one small illustration of sort of a larger dynamic in this country where we tend to malign people who have different perspectives than us. As Liz said during the intro, I've spent most of my career working on international conflict and peace building overseas, and I've transitioned to building a national organization called Urban Rural Action. It's a 501c3 that tries to bring people together across geographic, political, racial, and other divides to address challenges that impact all communities. And what I'd like to say is that, first and foremost, as we peace builders focused on the United States, we need to apply the same discipline and rigorous approach and best practices that we have used in conflict zones around the world to addressing conflict dynamics in the United States. And that means that we should start with a holistic conflict analysis, and that should inform our interventions. And as Liz said, I think that too often we fall short in that regard, because I think that polarization is often used as a shorthand for talking about conflict in the United States, when in reality that is one key dynamic among many. And when you hear people talk about incivility as the problem, then I think the only solution put forward is dialogue. And as Liz has said, and Chip has written in the chat, that's just insufficient. I find it's helpful from a conflict analysis perspective to think both about sort of intercommunal violence in the United States and community versus state violence in the United States. And both Shelley and Rudabeh have alluded to sort of the intercommunal dynamics, right? The cultural divide, Shelley, that you mentioned, urban, rural, conservative, progressive. And that is not just about incivility. It's also about a whole range of other contributing dynamics, partisan media, social media and misinformation, where the great data that Rudabeh shared from ACLED is unfortunately overwhelmed by lots of false information that is easily spread on those types of platforms, a political system that rewards extremism, the isolation that many people feel not connected to their community, not connected to people who disagree with them. We tend to sort ourselves into communities where people look like us and have the same perspective as us. Rudabeh talked about militias and widespread accessibility of guns. Those are all a range of dynamics that increase the risks of intercommunal violence. And there are episodes of that right now, as Rudabeh mentioned, but the risks are significant. I also think that we shouldn't focus exclusively on these sort of divides between reds and blues, urban, rural, and so on. We also need to look at community versus state. What are the manifestations of organized violence right now in our country? And the criminal justice system is one example of organized violence carried out by the state. And this is right, excessive policing on the streets. This is the death penalty. This is solitary confinement. This is young people being held in adult correctional facilities where they experience all types of abuse. That is, I think, as peace builders, we should be focused on manifestations of violence in our country, not just sort of the risks of future violent conflict. And of course, that type of violence fuels grievances. And it's not just grievances from sort of racial injustice, but Shelley, you mentioned sort of the health injustice, where COVID-19, of course, has meant that African Americans, Hispanics are much more likely to experience negative health outcomes. You mentioned economic inequality through the housing crash. That's another example. Environmental injustice. African Americans are 75% more likely than others to live near facilities that produce hazardous waste. Food injustice, where we have less access in certain communities to healthy food. An unrepresentative democracy, where a lot of people feel like either, and this is true sort of across the ideological spectrum, and this is where I see a connection between community versus state and intercommunal conflict. A lot of people in sparsely populated counties believe that their states disproportionately focus on urban communities and neglect through money and attention what's happening in more rural communities. So what does this all mean? In my view, it means that we mustn't choose between either repairing our social fabric on the one hand or standing up against injustice on the other, right? We shouldn't choose between either building relationships between conservatives and progressives and working across our cultural divide or standing up against oppression. We need to do both. And I believe that bringing people together across geographic, racial, and political divides, the way urban-rural action is doing, is a vehicle for advancing justice, advancing positive peace. I believe that you can build relationships as you solve problems, and you can solve problems as you build relationships. Those are mutually reinforcing. And I think that the advocacy work that Shelley talked about and that Liz, you and AFP have led is very much a complement to what we need to be doing at the grassroots level. And the final thing I'll say along those lines is that as peace builders, we should be looking at how we bring people together across divides to address these issues. And that means partnering with organizations that are tackling these dynamics. So on news literacy and misinformation, that maybe means we're working with organizations that educate people and train people on news literacy skills, like the News Literacy Project. That might mean we are working with democracy reform organizations to end practices like gerrymandering, or we're working with civil rights and human rights organizations. And so I appreciate the consortium, Liz, that you were describing and your partnership with Shelley and Instagram. I'll leave it there.
Okay, so thanks. I just want to also point out, because you're talking about the news as well, Amanda Ripley yesterday with the panel with Beyond Conflict really talked about that and how our news is all about the negative news, and then people walk away feeling anxious, hopeless, angry, and it's just kind of this contributing spiral. So on that note, I encourage people to look at Amanda Ripley's new article that just came out. So Julia, I think we've set you up perfectly. Take it away.
Yeah, indeed. That was great. And gosh, thank you so much for all of that really inspiring work and discussion. And, you know, I'm torn a little bit because, so I work for an international, nonprofit network of peace builders and democracy builders. And many years ago now, I mean, before the 2016 election, we really did some soul searching about the tools that were available to us to resolve conflict. And how we described it back then, over 5 years ago, is we said, we feel like we're losing the war of ideas. And that there's something happening in the zeitgeist that is against our values. And that people are starting to believe, our neighbors, our fellow citizens are starting to believe these other ideas. And so how do we combat a war of ideas? And is it with facts? Is it with talking about our differences? And I've spoken at several AFP conferences between that aha moment several years ago and now to say, now I recognize this as a whole field of narrative study. And so we talk about narratives a lot now. That is a very sexy topic. And so I just very briefly say what I'm talking about, but what I'm really interested in, because this is a topic of this panel, is a narrative of peace building. Like, what does it actually mean that we're doing? How do we communicate what we think we're doing so that we bring in other allies? Like Joseph just ended by saying, we need the folks who are working on democracy. We need the folks who are working on, media literacy, et cetera, et cetera. We need, how are we inviting more people in? Because all of the complex problems that we're all working on have a different piece of peace, and yet not such a unifying narrative. And so I'm going to talk about two kind of elements of that, because we've started researching this in the US on how should we be talking about peace building so that it resonates and that it's salient as a policy imperative. And what is the practice of narrative engagement that is going to achieve the various policy goals that we have. All right, so first of all, let me just even define what narrative is, because I think we use the term fairly loosely. And I am not an expert, but wow, have I spent a lot of time with different narrative experts. And I'm going to put in the chat, in fact, I'll do that right now, several documents that we've put together on narratives for peace and links so that you can consult those directly. Narrative is different from storytelling and stories because lots of different stories are out there, lots of different patterns of stories in the music that we listen to, the TV shows that we watch, the games that we play, the news that we consume. And there's a through line to all of that, which is how we're making meaning of the world. It's almost like the average of all of those stories add up to a narrative. Because some people talk about narrative as a deep cognitive process of how we make sense of the world. And they say we make sense of the world through stories. And so our understanding of these issues, racism, climate change, development, all of the very complex issues are dependent on a story that we have told ourselves because of all of the different narratives and how we're consuming information. And so when we want to communicate what we're doing, what the change that we want to see in the world, the partners that we're going to build, or the partnerships that we're going to build, is dependent on the framing that we put to our issues, the values, the metaphors, the examples we use, even the tone that we have. And so another tool in our toolbox is to deeply understand how narratives change people's understandings and how we can engage with those narratives. So, there's a ton, I say narrative engagement very poignantly, and I don't talk about narrative change because I really am, many of you have studied at George Mason University and you know the work of Sarah Cobb. I'm very much a fan of her work to say, there's a way of highlighting ways of thinking about an issue, a narrative that you can bring to the forefront, and repressing a different way, because we're all complex. We have all sorts of different competing narratives. So, when we talk about unity, when we say the word unity, what does that immediately bring forward to people? Well, you have a sense of compromise. You have a sense of, lack of diversity. It brings forth kind of conceptions, and you tell a story in your mind about what unity means. And so there's a pushback to that concept. So I am really in favor of our community thinking more deeply, both about what our peace-building narrative is, what the social science is going to tell us about how people are already thinking about peace and peace building. And we've done some of that research. And I'm so excited to be able to share some of it with you. We work with an organization called the Frameworks Institute. And the links that I put up there are on the AFP website, doing some research on how the US public currently thinks of when we use the term peace building. And peace can be a naturally passive concept in people's understanding, or we can make it more active. Actually, the word building, peace building, not just talking about peace, can kind of activate people feeling a little bit more sense of agency to be able to make a change, because we know from the science research that Liz was just mentioning that crisis fatigue and a sense of fatalism is real. And so if we're constantly talking about all of the problems and the root causes of conflict, which we love to talk about the root causes of conflict, without showing a path to the solutions, we can really depress support for our issues and make it more difficult for potential partners to see how they can find themselves in our issues. And so just a couple of things that I'd like to point out, and then I'm sure we're going to I'd much rather have a conversation with all of you about this topic and how it fits in with the struggle for racial justice, with combating all of the different issues that we have with regards to divisiveness, is that, we have to start with a vision. We learned this from our colleague from South Africa on the depolarization session that we had with Beyond Conflict yesterday. And we almost have to work backwards. And we need a common vision to communicate together the power of that vision, of what we're all working towards. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to be struggling for truth. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to be holding folks accountable. But if we find ourselves in a vision and a narrative frame for what we're working for, we can have a whole bunch of different stories that has that common through line. Because some of the research that what we found is that we're very fragmented in how we talk about peace and peace building. And it confuses our audience. They're not, they don't see themselves in our word and in our work, because peace can be seen as naive, not in service of justice, that somehow there is this trade-off. But when we very concretely describe what it is we're talking about, this is how it works, this is how we do it, telling that but framed in that broader vision, we can see the needle move both towards understanding and then support, and then active alignment and allyship with our causes. And the final thing that I'll say, and I am going to include a link to this, just because I've nerded out on narratives research, is that, it's not that facts don't matter, and I loved Rudave's presentation, but that facts have to be accompanied with a narrative frame and a solution if we're going to change people's understanding. And so there's a whole bunch of tips that the Frameworks Institute has put together on how to think about how we frame, how we use good research, how we use statistics in order to amplify this message. So I'm not saying anything so terribly new, because I've been talking about this in a lot of different forums, but we are applying this now in the US. There is a research initiative looking how people understand the word peace and peace building. And we're applying this and deep depolarization research to try and uncover a new form of restorative advocacy. It's a term that I've been using to say, how can we continue to advocate for the change that we want to see, using that good narrative science and using the depolarization research in order to find more allies. So it's not an either or, like Joseph was just extolling us. Because, we are not our audience. That was my biggest aha in the narrative work. We communicate with our own cognitive biases in mind. We usually sit around a table with people who think exactly like we do and come up with our campaigns. And we tell ourselves our story. We live by those stories. So that I think the job of peace builders, no matter where we're working, living in a conflict dynamic as we are, have to also question our own assumptions and biases and how we frame our work and how we talk about it. So I'll stop there, Liz, and hopefully there's a good time for change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, what's also really critical, we probably should have had them on this session too, but they had a session yesterday, is Beyond Conflict and the neuroscience behind it and the mental health. Tim Phillips of Beyond Conflict was telling me a story of how they're working on video games and having people from different communities or, on different sides of the aisle working together to solve a problem or playing a game that has nothing to do with anything. And so, and then how much more they think about, they think, better about each other afterwards. So anyway, so there's different things that can be done there in terms of, from a psychology perspective, and our field is not very good in the mental health psychology, and exactly what you're talking about is the narrative, Julia. We make, even overseas, we put out campaigns that work for us, for example. So lots of questions coming in. So one of them, and that was one of the questions, Julia, is how do you distinguish the narratives from a worldview to the US? And I know we've talked about this, and you'll have something very insightful to say about it.
Well, to a certain extent, narratives are a worldview, right? I mean, we talk about, and I don't know if you're talking about like our role of like American exceptionalism, if that's what the question is asking. Sorry, I didn't see how it was framed, because just maybe I might be confusing the question. A meta narrative, right, is kind of the overarching way that, how we see the world. So it might be somewhat synonymous, but I think sense making is a better way of putting it, how we make sense. And it does change. I think there's also, people are not so set in their ways that we don't have the ability to have new narratives come to the forefront. And there's lots of good research on how that's happened, and we've seen it happen in different public policies. But if you're talking about American exceptionalism, that is such a deeply ingrained part of our zeitgeist that when we were in the US doing research on peacebuilding and foreign policy, and how US or American citizens of all ages, races, economic levels thought about peacebuilding, our American exceptionalism, and the way that we need to engage in the world, and the responsibility we have, is still extremely strong. Obviously, evidenced by a strong support for our military as keeping us safe and secure and exceptional. And so we need to uncover ways of combating that narrative, or at least engaging it. Again, Sarah Cobb talks about narrative braiding, so that we can take aspects of what's exceptional, the ideals, the good parts that we want, and braiding it with a new understanding so that something new comes out. I think I saw that Kieran had mentioned, couldn't uncovering of the narrative be a peace project in and of itself? And he's exactly right. How do we braid new narratives together that doesn't make you completely take away kind of the way that you've been sensing the world all your life?
Well, Julia, one of the things that we had talked about is that if Americans can start understanding what peace building is at home and the work that has to be done here at home, that they would then understand, the work that has to get done overseas, and be more open to contribute to it. Because we don't really have a constituent for foreign assistance in the US, and people are always complaining that we're spending too much money, even though it's less than 1%. But I think that's one of the things we had talked about in terms of how it would help the worldview.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing actually is that borders are just blurring now, and that the way that we talk about peace at home and peace in the world, there's actually, the research did say, Liz, that they didn't, very few Americans, and most of us know this, have a good understanding of foreign policy or foreign conflicts. Very few people could actually name on a current conflict in the world when we ask them. So, if you want to start doing a campaign for peace in Yemen, you really have to explain where Yemen is, what's going on in Yemen, and how it affects, U.S. interests. So we really can't take for granted that there is an understanding, and yet there was an acceptance that peacebuilding was good. That was something that we should support. But we had to make it active. It couldn't just be a state of mind. It couldn't be a state of being. You had to work for it.
Okay, so thank you, Julia. Okay, so some of the questions, Shelley, I'm going to go back to you. What Republicans are interested in supporting this? I know that in the House, Congressman Lee there's many co-sponsors. So talk about that. And then today I read that President-elect Biden has said he's going to nominate somebody to also, reach across the aisle to have kind of this outreach office. And sort of what are your thoughts on that? So I'm gonna throw a couple of these things out here, and then people can jump in. Joe, one of the things I was and Rutabaga as well, I was talking. The article I sent you today had to do with the fact of the changing type of demonstrations. I know there were armed militia groups that surrounded the Michigan. I think it was the Attorney General, I believe. There's been lots of death threats to the individual, the elections, the Attorney General in Georgia, who's a Republican. So I think that's kind of the changing we're seeing of the threats, and I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that, and then also let's see what else. Also, somebody talked about, would this legislation impact or would Native Americans be involved in that? Because it's kind of, one of the next waves we're seeing is we want our land back. I mean, you're seeing protests that way. So anyway, I'll leave that out there for everyone to sort of jump in on.
Okay. Hi. So I'll start with currently for the Truth Racial Healing Bill, there are no Republican co-sponsors. As you can imagine, Congress has been super polar recently, and it's just been very difficult to get bipartisan support on a lot of legislation. I hope that will change as we're moving away from an election year, and folks who have shown through like their bipartisan support on maybe Black maternal health and other issues that they will support it. So I know that we have a coalition of folks that are definitely trying to push this and working towards getting a Republican co-sponsor. So currently we don't have any on either the House or the Senate bill. But as I mentioned before, the Senate bill was just released last week. So maybe we can get a senator on board. I think it's feasible. I have someone in mind, but hopefully that can happen. As far as, I forget what the other part of the question was. Liz, can you?
Native Americans.
Oh, yes. And Native Americans are included in the bill. We have a few organizations that we worked with personally who co-sponsored and support the bill. So yes, and the Truth Racial Healing Bill. As far as like HR 40, that is more focused on Black and Brown communities and that reparation work. But in the Truth Racial Healing Bill, Native Americans, basically all communities of color are included.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. We talked a little bit about the changing nature of how things will change in terms of demonstrations, what we're seeing right now. Any thoughts on that in terms of what we think we'll see moving forward? Any of the data? And Joe, any of your thoughts on that, sort of that urban-rural divide?
Sure, I can speak to that, just a more overarching kind of view, and I'm sure Joe has insights on the rural-urban divide. So something that we've been in, which is also comes out in this report, and how we can understand, if we start to see X when we might expect to see Y, that type of trajectory. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, there's certain risks associated with armed militia groups in the sense that they're organized, they're quite mobilized, heavily armed, and what we see, around the world with those ingredients usually. And also noticing is, like you're alluding to, is involvement by groups, by demonstrators beyond just those groups. There's we're seeing increasing amounts of like decentralized, but yet still armed individuals, whether they are responding to official muster calls, whether it's more of an overarching call to action, such as, stop the steal. It might be that people are showing up to respond to this in their own ways, whether it's through bomb threats, whether it's through showing up around a politician's home. And we're also seeing more activity by individual like sole perpetrator types who might be engaging in things, whether it's disorder at demonstrations or even outside of demonstrations, like might see hate crimes, things like that. We're seeing these shifts that it's not limited solely to armed militia groups. While of course they pose very certain threats, and they're not going away anytime soon. I mean, so many of them started out in response to President Obama coming through, and we're already seeing some of the organizing around that same type of organizing again now. So I mean, I don't think they'll be going anywhere anytime soon, but the risk goes beyond those types of groups. And what we can expect, not only from those, but also just mass mobilization of even unarmed but right-wing groups, and the real world networking, if you will, that these types of demonstrations and protest environments offer to these types of groups to allow for cross-pollination, reorganization, etc.
And I'll maybe just jump in to add that I think this specific question, Liz, is another good illustration of the need for us as peace builders to look at the various intersecting dynamics of a complex problem and conceive of our role as peace builders as approaching it in a holistic way. And so, right, access to military grade firearms, right, that is a problem that requires a legislative solution in part. The divisive rhetoric that fuels these types of protests is a dynamic that requires people across the ideological spectrum to stand up and condemn that rhetoric which fuels violence. The QAnon conspiracy theories, and right, I mean, that is in part sort of advocacy. Maybe we need to be pushing Facebook, not maybe, we need to be pushing social media platforms to make it harder for them to publish misinformation that can fuel violence and make it easier for them to restrict rhetoric that can have a direct manifestation of violence. But I also think there is a grassroots role as well of coming together and humanizing the people that we too often dehumanize, and coming together to, say, learn about news literacy and how we can distinguish fact from fiction. And I do think all of this supports the narrative idea that Julia was putting forward, that A, this can get a lot worse, and B, we have a role, we have an opportunity to do something about this.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I want to ask Julia, you were going to say something, but I'm going to add on to this. Okay, because I think this is a really, this is a really critical question for me. We tend to focus on these extremes on both ends. Do we ignore them? Do we focus more on the middle? Where I don't want to say reasonable people live, but where there's much more moderates. Do you do both? What's some of the advice that from your work and from what you're seeing root of A2 from data? What is your what's your advice on this, Julia?
Can I start? Yeah, I'm gonna. I'll put in the chat some research by someone in the Netherlands who does a lot of really great research on polarization. Actually, Bart Bradsma, who talks about not trying to dialogue with the extremes, but to lift up the stories in the middle. He talks about pushers. He has different roles that people play, and again, I'm going to take from our colleague from South Africa yesterday, who talked about trying to isolate the extremes and to essentially cut them off from supporters, and then seeing the majority of people who think differently than you are, that are on some kind of other side of the political spectrum, as potential recruits to whatever it is the issue is that you're working on. And that's why Joseph's work and, the way of just like criminal justice reform or climate change or the Allies for Our Racial Justice efforts, which we see how many allies there are, both, corporate sector. I mean, just it's light years away from where we've been. And so I think that the reason I focus so much on narratives is not to give the attention to the extremes as much. That's basically kind of what Bart Bradsma's research talks about. And then to find a way of calling in the potential recruits.
Okay, and Julia, can you explain calling in a little bit more?
Well, it's not me, is it? And I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the wonderful woman's name who, well, it's another article I'll put up that talked about, as opposed to calling out, what we see as either kind of toxic behavior or doing things that we find not in line with our values. Trying to find a way of calling in people. I think listening is a big part of that. It's Loretta Ross. Thank you so much. She's the one who's, I think, really made this idea of calling in as opposed to calling out more mainstream. And it's something that really resonates with me, especially with the narratives work. You gotta take your mute button off, Liz.
Oh my gosh. I'm terrible with it. Anybody else want to talk about that? Shelley, and if not, Shelley, there is a question for you on, sorry, my chat box keeps moving, but it was about a Trump policy, what they've done, and you started to talk about it. Shelley, do you want to talk about that?
Sorry, working on a meeting myself. Yes, so as I mentioned in the chat, I think that it was extremely disheartening to see that they were attempting to get rid of a lot of these programs. I know that personally, it impacted a lot of folks who are doing a lot of the diplomatic work at embassies, because that is where a lot of the programming was starting to be cut, but I don't think they actually went through with it. But the good part about all of this is that it made us realize more and more, which I'm sure folks already knew how important it was, to continue these programs, because I think that cultural awareness is a way that we're building peace amongst each other, instead of focusing on a lot of our differences, but what we actually unite on, and building that way. So they attempted to, but I don't think any programs were actually canceled.
All right, thank you for that, Shelley. Okay, so one of the other things I want to talk about is resilience. We're always talking about the problems, but what do we see as resilient in our society? And I think people, when you look at a country that sits high on a conflict watch list, but nothing's happening there, there's no violence there. What I think is important to know is you have to go look and see what's holding it back. And that can be a good resilience and a bad resilience. Like a very strong authoritarian state can block violence and conflict. Doesn't mean it's healthy resilience. So what are we seeing in the US right now that is resilient and that we can bolster? And what are some of the bad resiliencies as well?
I'll just start just with something that occurs to me. Again, I'm very into kind of these different narratives we could be highlighting, and I thought where was it sometime in the conference, reading about the fact that 95% of the stories of COVID-19 coverage in the US are negative.
That was amazing.
And yeah, and that globally, the stories of COVID-19 are like 50% narrative or negative. And so that there's 50% of stories of community solidarity. And those stories exist here. The way we are coming together right now under this pandemic exist. We just aren't elevating the way that we are building community. I actually see it in my own hometown, and I see it in the way that my kids and their friends are there for each other. And so I do feel that the pandemic, while it's been incredibly divisive, it's been this tool for pulling us apart. It's had horribly unjust impacts on communities of color. There's also been so many other stories of solidarity. And it's too bad we're not lifting that up, because I do think there's an aspect of taking care of each other right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a point and her research recently. Anyone else want to talk a little bit about that? One thing that I think is, the trust in U.S. institutions, Pew Research shows that have been going down dramatically over the last years, and even, before the Trump administration. And the one institution, though, that stays very strong is the military in terms of our trust. So I think that that's a critical piece of it. But I also think right now what we're seeing is our courts, whether you are a Trump judge or a Democrat judge, because before this, judges didn't see themselves that way. I had many friends who were Democrats and would go work for Republican judges, are the ones that are, saying no to the suits that are coming through from Trump's lawyers on the elections. So I think, our legal system is another, rule of law is another way to look as well. But I just thought that's interesting that's the trust in our institutions has been going down. Okay, so also staying on this media theme, and many, if you're younger, you might not remember this, but there was a time, Julie and I do, there was a time where we didn't have CNN and Fox News, and there was the Fairness Act that President Reagan got rid of. Is there any, and this is, I think, something to talk to Amanda Ripley about, is there any, do we advocate for laws, going back to the Fairness Act for news, or has the genie been let out of the bottle with social media? And some people are commenting in here that, Facebook and Instagram and others have been cracking down, and now everybody's moving to Parlay and getting off Twitter, let's say. Not everybody, but a good chunk of people. I think they had 2 million accounts since the election. And so this is a good question for you, Shelley. And also MeWe, which is the new Facebook. So Shelley, you want to talk about that in terms of what we're seeing on social media, and have we let the genie out of the bottle? Shelley, do you want to comment on this or no?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is my unofficial capacity. I think we have let the genie out of the bottle as far as social media goes. I think that at this point, which is why I joined Facebook and Instagram, is just seeing what we can do to be accountable and not targeting, but being more proactive on what's happening on the platform. It's funny with Twitter, a lot of it is in real time and like the fact checking that they've been doing. But I feel like social media is something that has gotten so large, and it's unfortunate how much individuals are on there and expected or believe everything that is on there, but it's happening. And everything that we can do, I know that, I'm fairly new to the company, that we did a lot as far as with the past election to make sure that we would reduce as much misinformation as possible on the app. But of course, there's so much more work to be done. And I think that as they continue to create positions like mine, to see different ideas on how we can be more proactive is a great way in that direction, because I think social media is a huge piece of fueling a lot of the cultural and racial divides that we have. And we need, as organizations who are doing peace building, need to figure out how we can work closely with this tool so that it can be more positive and not just negative.
You know, I'd add one thing to the social media point is that, you know, in addition to being like a purveyor of information, if you will, and, you know, the issues it might have with misinformation being rife on those types of platforms, it also does, I think, what, you know, the past world's CNNs and Fox News couldn't do, is the aspect of a platform for organization, a platform for taking things from online to offline, and how we're seeing, you know, very, very direct, literal examples, right? Like Kenosha would be, you know, quite easy to connect the dots, but even those where the dots aren't quite as easily connected would be where you're seeing the kinds of organizations and discussions and, you know, conglomerations online, and how that slowly trickles onto the real world. I think that is something that is unique and new, and something that perhaps we've put the genie out of the bottle and it's hard to put it back in.
I was just saying, put the cap back on. Okay, one of the questions that came in was around cancel culture. And I know this even when talking in, you know, my town, in terms of some of the issues that are happening. Our school board just voted on taking away the names of George Mason High School and Thomas Jefferson Elementary School. And, you know, that was a big issue. Whenever you bring up anything like that, you're canceling culture. We talk about that from a narratives perspective. Shelley, also Joe, anyone?
I mean, I'll say something. I think, you know, this is the balance between peace and justice, which is reconciliation. I literally just want to parrot back to all of you this wonderful presentation by our colleague in South Africa yesterday, because, you know, as Kieran said, you know, the discussion around the narratives and the history and the story has to be a conversation, and yet, you know, there is an accountability that needs to happen, and so the balance is a reconciliation process. And when it's one-sided, and it doesn't mean that the struggle isn't there. The struggle is there. We have to struggle against the past and the pernicious racism that it represents, and listen to the folks that have a different narrative, that they have a different way of making sense of the world. And so I think we're uniquely placed as a peace building community to be in these conversations, aren't we? But the cancel culture, you know, I think is a shorthand of when it's done badly, and it's not being restorative of societal relationships, with this long game and this vision at the center of what we're trying to communicate.
Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of take one small piece of the broader cancel culture topic. But I guess the first question, at least in my mind, is what leads people to say things that then results in them being canceled? And often it's not malice, it's ignorance. And so the question is, what are you then trying to achieve by canceling people for saying something that is offensive, saying something that's ill-informed? I do think that there are some things that are so over the line that deserve to be condemned, and someone should be penalized in some way and punished. And I think too often we err on that type of a response, and too infrequently do we sort of try to help that person understand why what they said may have been offensive. I think in a lot of the dialogues that Your Action convenes, there are conservatives who participate who are very nervous and reluctant to participate because they feel that they may say something that they will immediately be condemned for. And I'm not suggesting that it should just be no no constraints, I do think people should be held accountable for their words. Words matter. I also think that giving people the benefit of the doubt is an important ground rule when it comes to having conversations across divides on topics like race. I think most people come into those conversations earnestly, with a willingness to make progress on these issues and achieve better understanding. And if they're immediately condemned for using the wrong word, I think that does not further our effort. I think what does further it is calling them in, as Julia said. They are potential recruits to the broader movement for racial justice in this country.
Okay, so in the few minutes that we have left, this is the question Tim Phillips from Beyond Conflict asked me last week when we were talking. This agenda, some people will say, even though we're peace building, it is a liberal agenda. You're talking about social reforms. How then do we make it seem more inclusive, or make it seem not to be this very liberal agenda? What is some advice that you all have on that? Or is there any, or is there not?
Well, I can just say quickly, in our experience, I think that if you are trying to recruit people into this movement, then the people doing the recruiting need to reflect a diversity of thought. That's number one. Second, in my experience with the conservative leaders who we engage, they like an orientation towards action, and a pure focus on dialogue tends to turn them off. And I also think that focusing locally as opposed to nationally is helpful. It's very hard to reach agreement on sort of gun policy when you bring together gun owners and violence prevention advocates. But if you focus on issues like how do we prevent gun-related suicide in our communities, well, there's an opportunity to do that. If you focus on how do we address hunger in our communities, how do you address too many people being locked up and held pre-trial because they're too poor to afford to pay cash bail? How do we address that when families are broken up, people can't, business owners can't find people who have the skills to when they re-enter? So focusing locally as opposed to even statewide and nationally, I think is a way to bring together conservatives and liberals together.
Yeah, and is your video from the other day that you showed at the award, is that ceremony, is that up on your website?
It is. I'll drop it into the chat.
Please do. I thought that was a wonderful video, and really showed how you can talk about these issues, from, in the middle somewhere. Any other advice you have on that, Shelley?
Yeah, Joe definitely hit it perfectly. I completely agree with everything he said. And I also feel like when he was giving those examples, the huge piece is humanizing this. I totally think the local community piece is really important, but all those examples was him humanizing what is happening so that people can understand it from their perspective. I feel like sometimes we're so focused on our differences, but not that our values are very similar. I don't think we're that separated when it comes to those things. So just humanizing it, I think, is a huge piece. And unfortunately, we're not even able to come to the table a lot at all on these topics because it's just assumed. And I know that when I was reaching out to different Republican co-sponsors, that it took a lot of being intentional about what policies have they actually supported, and that I've seen that may not be straight out, a Democratic bill, but have similar values in something that I would have and would align with the Truth Racial Healing bill. So that is like a big piece as well.
So Shelley, on that note, that was one of the things that we committed to, is reaching out to the Global Fragility Republican co-sponsors to ask them if they would be interested in talking about Senator Booker's bill, trying to think about folks that have, understand what peace building and conflict prevention have been promoting it globally. Because as I've said, the irony is we passed this Global Fragility Act, but we really also need one for the US as well, because as we've been showing, this is a multi-dimensional problem. And the US is so different. Texas is different from Massachusetts, is different. This is a bigger issue than, and somebody asked about conflict analysis, and Joe spoke in the chat box that AFP has done some of this conflict analysis. We have, but we've done it at the 30,000 foot. We know what are the drivers of conflict in the US right now from a very global, from a national perspective. We also know how you can fix a lot of it. I think it's, will our lawmakers do it? We know how to fix criminal justice reform, but it's so decentralized, and no bill even got through Congress this last time. A lot of the things that were done at the state level, friends of mine that are state legislatures said it was kind of a Band-Aid. So those are the things that we know already. But it's going to be a long haul, because this problem didn't get solved just because we had an election. So
can I make one tiny suggestion, Liz? Sorry, I know that we're over time now, but I saw a presentation recently, and Chip House is on the call with us, that something that resonated with me was Robert Talisi from Vanderbilt University wrote a book called Overdoing Democracy. And he talks about the fact that we're almost over prioritizing our political selves right now, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, and we kind of need to step away from politics and political policy solutions and just find a way of being human together. Parents, gardeners, sports fans, and it's a little bit what Joseph was talking about. And so even, the bridge building that we do of five conservative friends and invite them to talk with 5 of your liberal friends, it's like the centrality of your conservatism becomes your identity in the convening in and of itself. And so Overdoing Democracy, slightly controversial title, it actually resonated with me a bit, that I would recommend. I thought it was thought-provoking.
Well, there's a lot more to be done here. And some people were asking about different organizations. We have the coalition that's promoting Representative Lee's bill and now Senator Booker's bill. Please get in contact with me. I can connect you. The Trust Network has set up, and that was really looking at election violence, but they'll be doing more of that. Contact me for that. Joe and I have set up a U.S. peacebuilding working group at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. It hasn't done much yet because I think as we were moving into the elections, but now, we have to think about, what is that policy that we're looking at, and putting together a transition memo for the new administration. So more to come, lots of work to do. Thank you all so much.